my main area is cardiovascular health and rehabilitation and prevention. I mean, I do love sport, but my focus is on exercise and health and rehabilitation. So this afternoon, I'm getting on a Boeing 777 to Montreal, and I'll be on that with about 350 other people. Could anybody tell me why that figure is significant?
One of them have an inherited cardiac disease.
Perhaps.
It's the number of people who die of smoking-related illnesses today in the UK.
No, I'll let you win the prize. It'll be the number of people that die under the age of 70 today in the UK from coronary artery disease. And in 50% of those, that will have been preventable. And so, and physical activity and exercise actually is an incredibly powerful prevention tool. And I'd like to highlight that. And I think it's important that we remember that. So I'm going to have a little bit more interaction from you in terms of the health promotion plug in a moment. It's Saturday, normally a day of healthy activity and leisure. So let's start with an experiment of cardiopulmonary exercise assessment at the low end of the exertion spectrum. And I'm just going to highlight a study that I'm involved in about assessing the cardiometabolic effects of standing at work. I'm going to share with you the data, and if you want to see the fuller data, you can watch Thursday night on Trust Me, I'm a Doctor, this coming Thursday and I'm on TV with Dr. Mosley and Dr. Van Turken on their program, highlighting this study, but I'll show you with the results before the rest of the British public. And what we did is we estimated the amount of calories a person will expend sitting at a desk compared to standing at a desk in an afternoon. And we used CPEX to analyze those two positions, and we derived the calories from that. So we can see that if you're standing in an afternoon of work compared to sitting, you're burning about 0.8 calories a minute extra just standing. But if you did 3 hours of that a day over the course of a year of work, that would come to about 40,000 calories, or the equivalent about 10 pounds of human fat. So the other interesting thing is you've all had probably something sugary now at the coffee break. And if you continue to sit there, these are the results post-lunch with these people in an estate agents in Chester that we examined. And it's a real setting, and this is where the TV cameras come in. And those on the sitting day, after lunch, there's the rise in their blood glucose, and that's for the afternoon up until about 4:30 from 1:30. And this is the standing day on their blood glucose level, so just dropping. So Sanjay's standing up. Stay standing, Sanjay, stay standing. But my wife asked me the other day about impact factors for publications. And she said, well, what criteria you use for impact factors? And I said, well, just look at the front cover of the journal. If it's got 3 or less words in the title, it will probably have a high impact factor. So she said, what, like the Daily Mail? Yep, so I'm published in the Daily Mail for my standing up work. So I now have reached the climax of high impact statements. So, with exception to those in this room who are either unable, injured, or ill, I'm going to have to stand for the next 35 minutes. So I'm going to invite you to stand for the next 35 minutes. Please stand up. There is no reason for you to sit. And in fact, what I will prevent is any of you working on your computers, doing your emails, or your next presentation if you're on this afternoon. And you're going to stand for this presentation, and now you can feel your blood glucose. It's peaked, and it's going to come back down a little bit, which is good for your health. So, pardon? If you need an interval of sitting, that's fine. But then when we go to ask questions, you're definitely going to sit down, because I'll need to remain in a position of authority over you. Now, exercise is only one component of cardiac rehabilitation, and I will refer to that in my issues about cardiopulmonary exercise testing, and it's one of the lifestyle factors. The cardiac rehabilitation is a multifaceted. It isn't just exercise, but more importantly, it is a behavior, and detailed exercise physiology is of no use unless we can actually get people to do it. So we can talk about medicine and physiology till the cows come home, but unless we can get people off the couch and on their feet, it is no use. And so the psychologists actually have the biggest challenge in terms of health behavior, not the medical people. If you think about the benefits of people with heart disease, and that's including heart failure, we have a large reduction in premature mortality from people doing exercise, and the big one is unplanned readmissions is reduced sometimes up to half, and that's just saving the NHS quite a bit of money. So this is my public health message. You're all healthcare professionals. Above and beyond what you do in sports cardiology, you do have a responsibility to promote healthy living in everybody, and people look to all of you for that sort of guidance, and it is a bit worrying when most healthcare professionals don't know the standard issues about the benefits of exercise. So we have our standards are published in a reasonably impact journal in Heart, and please do have a look at that because most of you are involved with cardiovascular health and not just sports cardiology. It is important, I feel, that everybody is aware of what the general public and patients should be expecting from rehabilitation. Now, this is Sir Roger Boyle's favorite slide because in 2000 they had the National Service Framework for Coronary Artery Disease, and they had a huge reduction in premature mortality and incidence of myocardial infarctions in that time, beating the target for 2010. So there has been a 40% reduction in people dying prematurely from coronary artery disease. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean that we've got rid of cardiovascular disease. There's just as much cardiovascular disease. And the other thing that's on the rise, come on, up, there we go, is heart failure. So we're keeping all these people alive now with their coronary artery disease, but because the heart is being challenged, because either it's ischemic or it's damaged or chronic hypertension, we're going to have a large rise in people with heart failure. And this is sort of where I feel the parallels come in with athletes, is that if you take people with cardiopulmonary dysfunction, really they are working at the ends of their limits. And therefore the physiology and the exercise prescription and exercise testing is very much the same because the athletes work at the ends of their pulmonary, cardiac, musculoskeletal function, and so do our cardiopulmonary patients. And so really this is to highlight that we can apply these principles of the physiology of exercise at both ends of the spectrum with great benefit. So we have in this session to review some theory and practice of CPEXing in these two extremes, and we have 5 sections in order to cover those. How are you doing standing up, by the way? All right? Yeah, you probably forgot that you were standing up, but how many people have children? Okay, just imagine that between the ages of 5 and 12, children stood up at school rather than sat down. And if you think of those caloric expenditures and those obesity things, we may not even have to go to the behavior of sport and exercise and physical education. We have to build it into people's daily lives. In terms of CPEX testing, most of you and most people think of it simply in this, but that's only 1/3 of the component of cardiopulmonary exercise testing in terms of diagnosis, prognosis, screening, and risk stratification. Actually, it really comes into its own in terms of using the data for exercise prescription and measuring outcomes. And one of the outcomes that doesn't often get measured is if people have cardiovascular disease and they are treated medically, how often do they get a follow-up exercise test in order actually to show the benefit of that medication. And again, with heart failure, if you look at the evidence for people who are given a beta blocker prescribed with heart failure, and you look at the data for them being retested, simply after that intervention, their function goes up considerably. And if you can show the patients that these are all the sorts of things that will lead to encouraging them to change their behavior in terms of the benefits. Because unless people are exercising and exerting themselves, they really have no idea of their capabilities. Whereas if they can become exercisers, they then start to make evaluations of themselves on a daily basis. But if they're just sitting in a chair, they really have no idea of their function. So we go to these sorts of scenarios where, you know, even when you don't pass the fitness test, you still get the job. But size, I'm going to focus on size does not always matter as well. And I've noticed yesterday came in and today people are talking about VO2 peak, VO2 max, and it seems to be the only thing that gets talked about. I'd like to focus on that concept and saying that really you should be looking at other things besides that score. So what we're going to do is, in terms of the theory of exercise testing, remind ourselves of the Fick equation and the Fick principle, which dates back to the 1870s, and that the oxygen uptake is a function, as you know, of the cardiac output and the ability of the muscles to extract oxygen. Now, we can use cardiopulmonary testing to also determine where in this chain of events between circulation and muscle O2 usage and the pulmonary function in exchange, where the problem lies. Because sometimes we don't always know. If a person's breathless, is it due to their heart? Is it due to their lungs? Or actually, maybe their skeletal muscles are the primary factor in that chain. And cardiopulmonary exercise testing allows us to have that picture so that we can focus our intervention or our treatment or our advice, whether we need to give them inspiratory muscle training, or maybe they need to do some strength training in their muscles, and that will make the difference. So Wasserman et al. Have created this nice textbook, and this is their standard integrated model of ventilation, circulation, and muscle function, and it's a nice little model to remind us that if any of these cogs goes out, it can be evaluated based on the exchange of respired gases at the mouth, that any part of this chain, and we can use the data that's come out into the CPEX machine to determine perhaps where the problem really exists in the chain. So this is basically the Bible, and if you are looking to do some more information on CPEX testing, then you should really be looking at this as a nice manual. Now, going back to some of the things, the concept of the anaerobic threshold was actually not determined for athletes. It was determined because Wasserman said, I don't really want to push my cardiac patients to maximum if I can. If I can find out where their muscles start to require a boost from the anaerobic system to keep the body going, he said that's really the important part of function in the human, is what can they do, what is their functional level, not necessarily their maximal level. And if we look at athletes, it's not their VO2 max. If you take a group of athletes and you look at their VO2 max, it will not predict their performance. What will is how much of that VO2 max they can use at a given speed. So on to the next bit then, in terms of looking at risk, morbidity, and mortality. Well, Roger Bannister was a student at St. Mary's Hospital in London. He was using this technology to try and break the 4-minute mile, and he realized back then that actually for the years, his VO2 max was not changing. After 2 or 3 years, he's doing all this training, and he got really depressed, thinking, how am I going to break the 4-minute mile? But he finally came round to the principle that actually it's about getting as much bang for your buck, and that's and changing the training. This is Jeremy Morris, who showed the first person ever in history to show the link between health and disease and physical activity and exercise, as you know, by his London bus conductor's study. So Myers published in the New England Journal of Medicine this nice graph showing the relationship between premature mortality in normal healthy people and people with cardiovascular disease and the risk of premature death, and basically showing that the survival of the fittest. And normally what we tend to do is we have a target in terms of health of an aerobic capacity above 8 METs. And once people have 8 METs is a VO2 of about 8 times 3.5 is about 27. So if you've got a VO2 max about 27 or higher, that is considered to be healthy. If you have a VO2 max less than 27, you start to have the equivalent of being a smoker or being obese or diabetic, and they line up nicely with the other parameters. So often, if you're looking at your patient populations, really, if you use 8 METs as a marker, and that's 3 stages of a Bruce protocol, if they can get to 3 stages of the Bruce protocol, give them a hug, give them a pat on the back, give them lots of encouragement, because actually, in terms of prognosis, that will be the best predictor. Not what's on the ECG, not what was in the blood pressure, not what's in their diabetes, but their fitness. And showing this in the same paper, he showed that if you were fitter, even if you had any of these conditions, your risk was significantly reduced by being more aerobically fit, in spite of still continuing to have that. Okay, so in the early 90s, VO2 max less than 14 was shown to be a strong predictor of mortality and was used as a cutoff point for the indication for surgery, whether it be bariatric surgery or heart transplants or whatever the surgery was in terms of being fit to be operated on. So in terms of the prognosis, we use ventilatory measures, tidal volume, ventilation, ventilatory thresholds, respiratory compensation threshold, I want to talk about those, the gas exchange factors, and finally the derived factors of those 2 elements. So we're going to look at some of these key factors in relation to disease and also performance. So here's a standard, what we call the 9-panel Wassermann plot, and this information can be used for all those purposes there. And if you have a computer system, usually it says, do you want a Wassermann? And that's what it means, is this 9-panel plot. So I'll go through some of those key aspects. But generally, we know that if you increase exercise intensity from rest up to max, we get a linear increase in oxygen uptake. And that's the very simple term. Everything else is curvilinear. Everything else in relation to the exertion is curvilinear. So if you measure the VCO2, up until this sort of moderate intensity level, you get a linear increase in carbon dioxide production with VO2, and they feel nicely. And then you start to get a bit out of breath, and it's because the buffering of the various pH changes in the circulation and in the muscles creates an excess of CO2. Those both together drive the ventilation, and therefore the ventilation, and you can see the carbon dioxide production are very closely linked, and the oxygen uptake just stays on its nice little path linearly here. So if you're looking at our national guidelines for physical activity that states that people should be physically active 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity activity, the moderate intensity activity is in this zone between about 40 to 70% of one's VO2 max. And that's what's meant by moderate intensity. So getting slightly on a puff is this business of just starting to produce a small excess of CO2. We know the body starts to adapt to compensate for that. But in terms of the technical terms, the ventilatory threshold or the anaerobic threshold occurs where VCO2 and ventilation start to increase in a nonlinear fashion compared to oxygen uptake. And then we have a breakaway of the ventilation from VCO2 at a higher intensity, which is called the respiratory compensation threshold. And this is an important diagnostic point for heart failure, but it's also an important element for elite athletes because often they are exerting themselves at these levels, and so is the heart failure patient. So we can see here's a typical, a real graph, and we can see the V and VCO2 breaking away from the VO2, and then here we can see the respiratory compensation threshold where the VE actually goes off on its own little excursion away from VCO2. So last year at the BCS conference, we had a bit of a competition between Dr. Joe Mills, who's a cardiologist at Liverpool, and he competed against Rebecca Romero. She's a gold medalist in cycling from 2008 in Beijing, and she's also a silver medalist in rowing from 2004. So we put them on the bikes, and the Watt bikes, and these were the bikes that Cry was. We went to the Cry stand and nicked them off the Cry stand and said, let's put them on the CPEX. So thanks to Cry for the bikes. And we had a go, and we took them both to VO2 max. So we'll just look at average Joe's responses. And what we do is we do a ratio between the ventilation, the minute ventilation, and the VO2, and the minute ventilation and the VCO2. And you can see clearly here that we've got a ventilatory anaerobic threshold occurring at this point, and then the VEVO2 breaks off in a very sharp acceleration, so that the amount of oxygen that we're trying to get in is not being matched in relation to the ventilation. So really the lungs are working quite hard, and less oxygen is actually going in, which is quite a significant perspective. Then we have the respiratory compensation threshold that we can see in the VE-VCO2. So I just want to look at these in a little bit more depth here. Now, what we do is we tend to use a ratio or a slope and a normal ratio, and even while you guys are standing there at the moment, if we took a ratio between in liters per minute between how much oxygen you're consuming and how much air you're breathing in and out of your lungs, the ratio would be about 25 to 1. 25 liters of air going in and out of your lungs per minute will deliver 1 liter of oxygen per minute into your body. And that relationship happens between rest, even while you're sitting, and stays the same. There's a matching all the way up until you get to this ventilatory anaerobic threshold. And then once you get past that, then that VE-VO2 relationship starts to accelerate. Now, you also get the same ratio with the VE-VCO2, so the carbon dioxide and the ventilation at that point. But if you look at the slopes at maximal exercise, the VE-VO2 now is very steep, and you get a ratio of 43, and you get a VE-VCO2 of 30, a ratio. So 30 liters a minute of ventilation to get 1 liter of oxygen, or 1 liter of carbon dioxide out. And that, at maximum, still represents a normal, healthy response. But when you start to look at this figure in diseased populations, it starts to get steeper much sooner. So here, if we have a look at Joe's ventilatory equivalents, up to the respiratory compensation point, we can see that there's a nice linear relationship with the VE-VCO2, and his slope was about 26. If you go back to your GCSE maths, y equals mx plus b, and the slope is the value there. And if we look at this study here, where you've got a normal, healthy individual, the slope of the VE-VCO2 pretty much remains the same throughout the exercise test at a value of 27. So that's not far off what we had with Joe at 26. But if you look at the heart failure patient, not only do they have a very limited capacity, but the slope is at 48. And a slope of greater than 35 actually has quite a diagnostic indication. So since 2000, heart failure treatment has improved. We know that heart failure treatment we have has improved survival greatly. The development of the use of the beta blocker with heart failure patients. And the VO2 max, VO2 peak estimation of prognostic indication has become weaker. So additional analysis has been used for ventilatory equivalence, which we've just described in terms of the slope, but also the oxygen uptake efficiency slope, so the VE-VO2, is also becoming an important indicator within the prognostic indicators. So again, VO2 max is starting to lose its power here in the clinical populations, and I will show you that VO2 max actually doesn't have great power in the athletic populations either. Another area is oscillatory breathing at rest and low exercise intensities, which can be picked up by these breath-by-breath analysis systems that we have. And showing the various classes of heart failure, you can see that there's as the classes go up, the VE-VCO2 slope goes up. So a normal, and if you're in class 1, you've got a normal slope at 30, but then it gets above 35, and if you're looking at a class 4 NYHA class, they have these very steep VEV CO2 slopes. So you can, the exercise test doesn't have to take very long, and you can see that slope happening right away. And here are some survival curves showing the difference with a cutoff of 36.5, how much there is a difference in terms of survival in individuals with that slope at high or low levels. So we've got this indicator of VeVO2 and VCO2 now as a prognostic indicator, and this in this issue of nonlinear submaximal VO2 efficiency curve. So these are important indicators that you want to look at on your trace. Here is that paper in a little bit more detail, and you can clearly see this oscillatory breathing, and it has a prognostic indicator of early mortality and morbidity in heart failure as well. So even if we can't get people to maximum, there are many indicators that we can get at submaximal. Because if you think of your typical heart failure patient, you put them on a bike or a treadmill, and they might have some arthritis in their hip or their knee, or they might be fearful of the occasion. There still is lots of good data, even if you don't get the criteria for peak or max out of them. So these are really good elements to look at. But this is nothing new. In Ireland in 1818, Shane reported on periodic breathing, a case of apoplexy in which the fleshy part of the heart was converted in fat, so showing that the oscillatory breathing thing really isn't anything of any new. How are you doing? Standing up. You all right? Is it okay? Could you do this? I mean, I have to do it all day. I teach all day long. And, and the students sit there all day and they start falling asleep. And there's no way you can fall asleep if you stand up. So it's pretty good. So if we look at comparing our heart failure man, remember he is going to climb these stairs, and the typical MET value for climbing a set of stairs is between 4 and 7 METs, depending on the pace. So even if he's got a VO2 max of 4 or 5 METs, he's working at max to do a very functional activity. So you can imagine that if we can improve his aerobic capacity even by a small bit, or improve his efficiency, that his quality of life can change. And we know that if the athletes make a small improvement in their efficiency or economy, not their capacity, that makes the difference between winning or losing. So if you've got a rowing crew of 4 guys, it's usually, if they're not quite in sync, then the efficiency of the whole crew is out just because one person is causing problems. So this whole concept of economy and efficiency, actually, which we can measure with CPEX testing, and we tend not to look at that data. So with the data, we can look at all of these various factors, which actually all relate to performance, whether in this crew or whether it's in performing activities of daily life. And rehabilitation is about educating this man how to move efficiently, how to prepare for being active, which actually enhances performance, which will make a difference between his independence and dependence. The other factor that people tend to think about is when people get heart failure, they think that, well, their activities level goes down, so the muscle function goes down because of inactivity. But it's not just inactivity that causes problems to skeletal muscle. If you have cardiac or kidney or pulmonary disease, there is, through all these factors from hypoxia, oxidative stress, all these inflammatory processes that have an impact on the function of skeletal muscle. So it's not just the impact of reducing people's activity that affects their skeletal muscle. It is the disease. Now, luckily, you guys in the medical profession haven't figured out a way to fix muscle. Once you do, then us exercise guys are out of business. And the only way to really improve muscle is to exercise it. So we haven't got a medication that will have an effect on skeletal muscle function. So even some basic strength training exercises that people can do in a chair will actually have a reversing beneficial effect from these chronic diseases. So we've got our athlete and we've got our heart failure patient, and they both tend to operate at or above the respiratory compensation threshold. So in looking at these to conditions. We know that looking at CPEX testing, that doing things like inspiratory muscle training has been able to provide additional performance, because what happens is when you're working at your respiratory or above your respiratory compensation threshold, your accessory muscles in the chest cavity are actually doing more work, and they're starting to require more oxygen. And what happens is oxygen gets taken away from the performing muscle and sent to the inspiratory muscles to help with that accessory breathing. So if you can train the inspiratory muscles to operate more efficiently, then you can maintain a larger proportion of oxygen going to the skeletal muscle. And again, CPEX testing has been able to show these changes in exercise economy from simple things like inspiratory muscle training, which is beneficial both to the athlete and to the heart failure patient. Another area is, besides inspiratory muscle training, is interval training. And the training that makes the difference between winning and losing these races is not their aerobic endurance. We know now that even with the marathon, it comes down to a sprint or the last mile, and which is high levels of anaerobic work for short periods of time. We also know that that works with the heart failure patients. And in fact, when you look at the studies that have been done, they're doing maximal lifts with weights, and there are no incidences of events, and they're doing high-intensity exercise for short periods of time, and there are no cardiovascular events. So we're seeing that even high-intensity exercise, if it's done in a proper way with good warm-up and good cool-down, even heart failure patients can perform these safely and gain much more benefit than doing what we tend to think of as this continual aerobic type activity. The problem is actually getting people to do that type of activity and when withstanding it. So in the data, in terms of heart failure, VO2 peak shows an increase with combined resistance and endurance exercise by 11%, where endurance only is 5%. So the combination of strength training and endurance training in heart failure patients, like the athletes, even our skinny little marathon runners, if they're doing some weights, which helps them with the last mile or two with a bit of power, that is important to performance. So Roger Bannister realized this, and he used interval training back in the 50s in order to gain extra tolerance to the high intensity which he was trying to withstand. And he then showed that it wasn't his high oxygen uptake that was limiting his performance. It was actually his ability to tolerate anaerobic metabolism. And that's what the interval training did, and that's what the heart failure patient is faced with every day. They stand up out of a chair, and they have to move up the stairs or go to the loo. It's a short period of time. They've been sitting at rest. It's anaerobic work that they have to do. So it's similar to the heart failure patient and the ejection fraction. When is ejection fraction going to get chucked out? It's cardiac output is the key issue. It's only a percentage. And we seem to spend a lot of time on using ejection fraction as a marker, and yet it does not predict at all one's functional capacity. We cannot make any judgments about a person's functional ability based on their ejection fraction. Here we have people with an ejection fraction almost normal at 50, and they've got, a low aerobic capacity, and somebody who's got an ejection fraction of 15%, and they've got a higher VO2 max. So we must exercise test people. That is the story, is you have to assess people's functional capacity with testing, not some measure that you take while they're sitting on a bed at rest. We have to assess function, and the CPEX provides us with that. So ejection fraction, the argument is, well, it has to do with skeletal muscle oxygen extraction. I'm not convinced, and somebody needs to do some more research about measuring cardiac output during exercise, because it's what happens to cardiac output during exercise which is important. And we know that many athletes, top endurance athletes, actually have low ejection fractions. But that's at rest. What happens to the heart when they exercise? And what happens to the heart's response to exercise with training in the heart failure that we don't pick up with the echo So we may not see no change in the echo, but at rest. But what happens if you looked at the echo following a period of exercise training? Okay. In terms of heart rate, max and recovery, in the healthy person, if we exercised any of you couch potatoes on a regular basis, we would not see an increase in your maximal heart rate, but we would see a decrease in your heart rate at any given work rate, and we'd also see a quicker recovery time. Where in the heart failure patient, actually you tend to see a heightened maximal heart rate and also a quicker recovery. And so if you compare the couch potato, the heart failure patient, and the elite endurance athlete who are now undertake an endurance training program, if you take the couch potato, you could probably improve their VO2 max by 10 to 25%, or their performance by 10 to 25% due to an increase in VO2 peak or max, no change in heart rate max, an increase in stroke volume, and an increase in muscle oxygen extraction. In the heart failure patient, the one change is the heart rate max. In the elite athlete, you see no changes in any of these because they've already reached their maximum. So the only thing that can really change is skeletal muscle metabolic facts and tolerance to high-intensity activity. Finally, VO2 max size does not always matter. And so we're looking at all of these people, and even in the heart failure patient, again, we look at their capacity, the 6-minute walk test distance, and yes, we do some predictions on that, but it's not. It's economy. Now, I've taken this out of, I don't know if you've seen Wilmore and Costello. They have this slide here, and they show that VO2 max in the lactate threshold, but what they don't mention in this slide is that athlete 2, even though they've got a lower lactate threshold, athlete 2 is actually more economical. They use less oxygen. And that is as important a fact as actually improving your VO2 max, is that if you can get more bang for your buck, that's the same as having a higher VO2 max. And if you look at determinants, say of this paper showing race walking, they looked at all the determinants of these guys' performance, and the two highest determinants in terms of the regression were walking velocity at the lactate threshold and the lowest VO2, the economy, getting more bang for your buck. The VO2 max actually only predicted about 20% of the performance variance. The VO2, even at the lactate threshold, only predicted about 25% if we're looking at these values. So it's important that we look at these other aspects when we're looking at the CPEX data. And this is a nice paper showing here are the running economy in the East Africans versus the European runners. And if you're looking at, this is 16 kilometers per hour is a 6-minute mile. So they're looking at their paces between a 6-minute mile and about a 4.5-minute mile, and showing that the amount of oxygen that's being used by the East Africans is significantly lower at all of those running paces. So that's the same as having a greater VO2 max. When you look at rowers and non-rowers, we get this. Rowers tend to have are more economical, and even if we looked at people performing treadmill exercise compared to rowing, and these are cardiac patients that we measured at Stoke, the hospital in Stoke, we saw that for the same heart rate and oxygen uptake, but they were more economical in terms of metabolism, looking at our respiratory exchange ratio compared. And that's simply because people walk more. So we can when we train people, we can probably improve their economy. So here is some startling evidence about economy in heart failure patients, that it's not the increase in VO2 peak that's significant, it's the heart rate and the submaximal work rate economy that have improved greatly as a result of the training. And this is only possible to determine this through CPEX testing. So these are the sorts of things that you might want to look at when you're testing people, is look at various athletes and look at the running speeds or the treadmill speed and the gradient, and look at how much oxygen they're using at that speed, and look at different individuals beyond the VO2 max that you get. So improved VO2 kinetics Also happens in heart failure patients. This is something else we look at in CPEX testing, is how long does it take? If I start some exercise, in most of you, within 2 minutes, we'll be able to deliver the required amount of oxygen to your skeletal muscle. It may take a heart failure patient about 6 minutes to actually get enough oxygen flowing to the muscles to maintain aerobic metabolism. So in that patient, we have to do stop, start, stop, start, stop, start until we can actually get them going. We have this prolonged warm-up. But if you exercise, and this orange bit represents the amount of energy that's required from the anaerobic processes to keep the muscle functioning in that intervening time. And you can see that in heart failure patients, if you exercise training them, you improve their oxygen uptake kinetics, which we get from CPEX testing, and it shortens the amount of time before they get to that steady state. That makes a huge difference. They're getting less breathless, less fatigue in their muscles as a result of that. So, just to summarize, to get us back on time for the timing, for your short coffee break, so you can have a proper lunch break. Exercise testing for medical assessment and treatment is only 1/3 of its value, but most of the testing that's used stops at this point. We need to appreciate that there's a long history of CPEX testing. Don't lose sight of CPEX rudiments in technology. I do always show students the Douglas bag technique so that they understand what a piece of equipment is actually doing. Because if you don't, if the machine isn't reading quite right, you'll know it. If you've done the rudiments of understanding the Douglas bag technique, you will know whether the values are correct or not. Size does not always matter. It's about efficiency, economy, getting bang for your buck, and lots of valuable information from the CPEX, even if you fail to attain a maximal value from your participant, your patient, your athlete, whatever. So, if you wanted to make any comments about having to stand up, would you please put those on your evaluations? Because I would like to know this is the first time I've tried this experiment. So now I can invite you to sit down and become sedentary again. Thank you very much.